For today, we have three speakers. And the first one is Professor Fausto Giunchiglia, who will talk upon diversity and bias and related issues. Fausto is a professor of computer science at the University of Trento in Italy, and he's a member of the Academia Europa. His research is on knowledge management with a focus on managing diversity. He holds around 10 Best Paper Awards, gave more than 50 invited talks at international events, and chaired more than 10 international events. So, Fausto, you can start the talk. Thank you.
Okay, good. Do I have control of the screen? I guess right? Yes. So, good morning, everybody. Let me try to talk. So, I'm going to talk about diversity, bias, and related issues. I've been working on this issue of diversity for many years, and now I think I'm trying to correlate my work on the idea of bias. Too bad the slides get showed one order together, but anyhow, bias is everywhere. I mean, anytime, I mean, almost all conferences, almost all events, in AI we go to in the last 2 or 3 years, everybody talks about bias. Everybody talks about fairness, unfairness, transparency, and there is a good reason. I'll talk about this more in the later on. But it's a fact that the globalization of internet, all these lots of data. That are available, then all this issue of really reading and reading material and seeing material online that is that you don't agree with, that you think is biased, is very common. Now, in this talk, I'm really trying to get into the issues of, I hope that people hear me. Let me know if you don't hear me. I mean, Trika said that very good. So the real issue is really to talk a bit about bias, try to where it comes from, and if there is any problem for that. So I just got, I mean, there are answers to the definition of bias, but while preparing this talk, I just went to Wikipedia and I just got a quote from Wikipedia. Wikipedia for informal qualitative presentation is good enough. So that's the definition. You can read it. Bias is a disproportionate weight in favor of or against an idea or thing, usually in a way that is closed-minded, prejudicial, or unfair. And the people may develop biases for or against an individual, or group, or belief. And by the way, if you read it, the first sight sounds very good, very convincing. And why? Because it matches into your underlying understanding of yourself. You are very clear what you're in favor yourself. You have a very idea what when you talk to someone, you think this someone is prejudicial or is unfair, and so on. But if you really want to do a science, research on bias, there are issues like who decides what is a reference right idea, who decides what is disproportionate, and the bottom line here is: can we get an agreement? Can we agree between all of us, among scientists doing AI and people doing physics and people doing and like really religious people? So is there a viewpoint? I mean, if you want to do something about bias, I think first you should agree what bias is all about. And so we can't just really that we're going to just take our own view on bias, because if you just take your own view on bias, then your own solution to bias is just more noise into the bias. So the bottom line here is, I mean, what is bias and what we can do about it. And this is going to be my talk. My talk is going to be exactly the issue of bias, where it comes from and where we can go about it. And this is a starting point. And this is really from the title, diversity. I think that diversity between women and men is a fundamental diversity in nature. And this is just an example, but it's very clear that there are two different, equally good, equally great, or equally I mean, like diverse, equally diverse from one another way of thinking. And this is a starting point because from when you thought about the definition of bias that I gave before, there was implicit some notion of difference and diversity. And so I think that it's crucial to understand bias, to take your own stand on bias, and what you think is biased. I think you should really go to the notion of diversity as a very good foundational notion for understanding where bias comes from, is where it goes. So the first point is that you can think of the word, and the word is really about, and if you think of the word, and if you think ourselves, we as humans really describe the word. And usually, in many ways, you can think of any description given the word, meaning like in using language, it can be stratified in 3 layers. And my argument here is that in all these 3 layers, the way you describe the word is really diversity aware. So first of all, bottom line in the language. I mean, first of all, we have many different languages, and the language is not neutral to diversity. I mean, different cultures have different ways of describing the same thing. For sure, in Italy, you have lots of ways of describing food, like most Latin countries. Maybe the North Europeans don't have that richness, maybe because the weather makes it hard for them to talk about food, but they for sure know better how to name snow. This is a very famous example of the 12 names of snow in Lapland. So is that bad or good? It's just different. There is no value judgment. I'm not putting any value judgment on anything. About data, I mean, data is clearly context dependent, really. And why so? Because if you talk about transportation, right now transportation is on foot because we cannot fly anymore. Like a year ago, transportation would mean flying, or but it's also the role of space, right? When I wrote this slide for the first time, I made this first presentation, the president was Obama and the president was Berlusconi. Now we should say something else. And then there is knowledge. Usually people differentiate between data and knowledge, mean that knowledge is universal flavor. So knowledge is one property where you say, data can change, but not knowledge is really something stable, so that it can only grow in time. But if we get into the details of knowledge, you realize that what knowledge is for us who do in AI or computer science is very different from what people talk about knowledge in social sciences. And very different than people talk about knowledge in human sciences or in medicine. Is that important? Well, of course it is important. Or let me put it another way. No, it's not important as long as I'm a computer scientist and I only talk to computer scientists. But as a computer scientist, I talk to a medical doctor. It's a big difference. I remember the first time I talked to a doctor. There was a person near to me which was really sick, and when he asked him a precise question, like an engineer like me would ask, and I heard the answer for the doctor, I thought it was just teasing me. I thought it's just impossible that to get such a ridiculous answer from such an important question. And this, I think, is just pervasive. As long as you stay in your comfort zone, none of these diversities on language, on data, and knowledge play any role, because all the people around you are like you, or even if they are slightly different from you, you go used to them, so you know how to manage their diversity. But it is a fact that despite how you feel about it, diversity is pervasive in all we think about the world. And now in our word descriptions, but now the question becomes, okay, good. But you see, is that the case? No, of course not, because the word itself is changeable. I mean, it's different. I mean, like look at these pictures. I mean, these pictures are these cats or the felines. I mean, like how do we know they are cats? I mean, are we sure that the last cats on the right are really cats or something else, or wild cats? Are wild cats cats? You decide. I decide. Maybe in Italy, I don't care. We don't have wild cats. We don't have tigers, so it's irrelevant. Maybe in Africa, it's a big difference. So maybe in Italy, I don't really care. I would just see him from apart or see a wild tiger as a cat, because I don't expect to see a wild tiger, maybe as a wild cat. I think tigers are easily recognizable, even from far apart. But you see, there are all these dimensions, and but we see at the same time we all see they are cats. But all these cats, so as cats, they're just cats, but they behave differently. And even me, I'm one person. You are one person, but even yourself, you don't not behave the same in time. So the point I'm saying that the diversity in the language descriptions is really a mirror somehow of the diversity of the world, which really is the main motivation of why locally in space and time we take different perspective on things. So this is the first coordination, and then of course when you look into the diversity into the notion of diversity, you say, okay, where do they come from? Can we kind of define what are the sources of diversity? Yes, there are four. And first, space. Why space? Because you can call it geography, but like for sure the way the world is in different places in the world, in the earth, is very different. There is time, clearly. The world changes a lot of the time. And then there is representation, which is our key factor. I mean, when you talk by bias, very much you talk bias in representation. When you implicitly, when you talk about bias, you think of a different representation for your representation that you think is biased. And if you take a negative connotation to bias that you may take or may not take, but in most cases there is a negative connotation, as from the first slides, not only you say that this representation is not your own representation of the world, but it's also a representation you don't agree with. Notice that a representation is not an absolute notion. A representation is a relative notion. So you represent something. You have a representation of something in the world, or you have a representation of another representation. Use language to describe something in the real world. So representation is really the key generator of bias. And what is the bottom line is that every person have a different view on the world. And why? Because they live in different places, they live in different times, and they also have different brains, rightly so. We could even argue that's a good idea, it's a good thing. But that really what generates the difference in representation. And the diversity in representation, where diversity, I think, is an important notion as distinct from different, because different is a local property, diversity is a global property of a general system taken as a whole. And at bottom line, you have diversity in the representation so that people have about the world. And clearly then you take these representations, I say something now, and I say now here and now in Trento, but then someone else will hear this statement of mine now here in Trento, he's gonna take it somewhere learned in Cyprus in a different space, and then some other person can say to 1 week later, and most likely that one person, no matter how hard she works, she's gonna take it her own view on things. So you see, representation keep moving. So, and also depending on the mood of the person, is gonna have a different way, the same fact, my same statement was described. So pretty much what we get this endless process of re-representing the same thing, the same one phenomenon in time, anytime adding our own diversity interpretation. Okay, so is that matter? Of course, it's a matter. Now we get slowly we're gonna get into bias. So why? Because how do we translate? How do we say what I said before? First of all, because of the word diversity, what is the case is different for different space-time configurations. And by the way, exactly as now, there are only a small number of people who listen to me out of the 7 billion people who live in the world. Only a few people will read what is the case. And of course, will this presentation will be registered, which means if you're lucky, you can go from a few tens of people listen to my talk to a few hundred, but not for sure, not the 7 billion. So first of all, there is a phenomenon. Number two, very few people observe the phenomenon. In some cases, some people can see a registration of the phenomenon, which is not the same as the phenomenon. By the way, whatever it is, listen to me. All of you are making your own different minds. Some of you will like it. Some of you will think, oh, that's great, hopefully. Some of you will say, oh, this is all hand waving. Some of you will think, okay, or something will say, okay, I know this, or I don't know this. Oh, that's interesting. But see, all of you will have your own different representation, and your own representation will reflect how you're going to describe what I said. And of course, now you stop with this presentation, and then you go out, and someone asks you, how did you listen to the talks? Yes, did you listen to Fausto talk? And of course, you'll give a presentation, and you'll do your best, most of you. Of course, all of you, assuming good faith, you're going to give a summary of my talk. But then, of course, who are you? Are you a humanist guy? Are you a human science? You're a technology guy? Depending on what you are, you're going to give your own view. But you see, from my point of view, I could even argue that some of you are biased because you didn't get my point, or maybe I feel what you said as, oh, right, so she's not really fair to me. She didn't really get my point. Was she or he didn't think of this point that I made, and so on. So you see, no, and by the way, this is your own attitude, but then think of the listeners. And then the listener can again refer back. So the recursive communication process. And you see, what is interesting is that all of us are systems with memory, which is, that's a fundamental constraint, which is all knowledge extensions are conservative extensions which maintain, conservative extensions which maintain consistency, which is, if you get a bad idea about me in this presentation, maybe this will stay with your mind, and maybe next time you'll have this as a prejudice. I mean, is that a prejudice or an early, maybe not a prejudice, some kind of idea. So what is the bottom line? That no matter whether you like or don't like my talk, I mean, you make up your idea. This kind will build in your memory, and this means that the divergence will grow. It will go divergent between what you think, what other people among you, and with me. So you see, okay, so this is the fact of life, and doing a theory of diversity, because really a computer scientist and ultimately want to build theory. We really want to capture, I mean, we want to model this is information and knowledge management. You can really formalize these steps. And you wonder, okay, so I really want to understand diversity. I really want to understand where bias comes from. And I don't pretend to read these slides, it's a long slide. But the point I'm saying that, first of all, when you talk to there is a first source of diversity is the selected word event. So you are listening to me now. You could have listened to me in any other talks. You can listen to me when I teach. So even selecting when you talk to me, you just take a viewpoint. And then what? And then you make up your mind. That's the informal representation. Then again, you make your informal presentation. Now, suppose then later on you're asked to formalize because you're building a file system, you're building a search engine on talks, on like online talks, and then of course you have to provide metadata. Okay, which metadata? You choose. I mean, are you choosing metadata about the topic? Which topic? Are you going to choose which words are going to use? So you see, when you start the formalization step, which is what you need when you do computer science, you're making a lot of choices. First of all, in the choice of the metadata, and number two, in the values of the metadata. And then, of course, the values of the metadata. We do know the values of the metadata are sentiment sensitive. So it may be like metadata which instill a good feeling, and metadata which instill a bad feeling. So what I'm saying that there is another major step about generating the description so that computers can handle it. And then, of course, so good, what you've done now? Now you have done, you create the metadata, and then now you feed it in what? In a search engine, into a machine learning engine. And then, of course, they will take your bias and they will make extra bias. And then, of course, the people will come around and tell you, look, that's not right. I can give what fairness means. But then, which point of view they're taking? They decide what is their fairness notion. Fairness is it's one thing which is very cultural. And of course, you could argue that at least in the Western world, pretty much you do have a level of agreement on what fairness is, but macro level, micro level, I don't think so. And of course, if you do the same, and if you do for computers, and if you think about this, now you say, okay, sorry, let me go back. So now if you do the diversity, okay, so what are the sources of the biases? What are the dimensions of biases? You see, what is the point here? The point here is that for any single step, there was one or more potential people, observers, as you want to call them, they took their own view. And clearly, any single step in this process of formalization and making machine readable what people said, what I said in my talk, is a source of bias. So what are the dimensions of the bias? The dimension of the bias are simply the people who do the work or translating the word event into represent to be manipulated, in our case by computers. So there is introduced bias introduced by the observer, by the formal modeler, by whoever puts it on the computer, by the algorithm, by the article expert who just came here to tell us how to fix a problem, and of course we bring his or her more bias. And so I think the bottom line is that, let me read this sentence which I like, no matter the role, anybody involved in the process of interpretation of the word, and also in the process of communication of its representation, we bring a diverse point of view. And automatically, all of us, including me, are a source of bias. And of course, I'm a source of bias from your point of view, but from my point of view, I'm sure that I have the right perspective. And so, and this is the game. We are right. You all think we are right, and we all think the other people have a different view. And sometimes when they get extreme, that becomes bias. When this kind of diversity gets a connotative, that's a negative connotation. And by the way, I'm not arguing whether the negative connotation is right or wrong. I'm just saying that even the notion of right or wrong, and therefore or bias, is a relative notion. So the point here is that out of this is that I think we all agree on something, that there is bias everywhere. And of course, we all agree that there is bias, but I'm pretty much sure that anytime we agree on bias, then when you get to the details what bias is all about, we'll have different views. Rightly so. Rightly so. By the way, this is exactly right. So, okay, good. So where are we? Are we stuck? We have no hope. So from my point of view, I'm sorry, I'm going too far, too slow. So are we done? Are we out of, is all lost? No, I don't think it's all lost. You see, because too bad I don't have an animation, but in this slide with animation, we can see that, you see, this little bag can be food. I mean, I had wonderful Thai food within these bags. So it can be like a problem. If you go and talk to the farmers here in Italy, there is a big problem we have. So the bottom line is really, anytime, assuming that there is good faith, of course, I'm not taking bad faith. Anytime you take a stand, we are always maximizing the need, we're doing something for a purpose. I'm assuming good faith. And therefore, and this good faith is at the root itself of culture. It's actually why, I mean, Chinese are different from Europeans, and that's good, because, I mean, think about it would be that the world was full of Europeans or full only of Chinese. I mean, how many missed opportunities we would have to learn more about different cultures and perspectives. But then, of course, as a computer scientist, the fundamental issue is how we do with this and how we deal. What is the bottom line? The bottom line is that I do have a few minutes because I started 2 or 3 minutes late. Is that the bottom line is that if you really want to solve the bias problem, I think you really need to put at the center the diversity dimension. You really need to understand this diversity and really trace diversity and see and explain to yourself and to the others why and where this diversity comes from. And then, of course, then if you want to be transparent, you'll be transparent. But then if you want to make do fairness, that's very good. Also because when you do your fairness judgment, you will give your fairness judgment. And no matter what it is right or wrong, whatever fairness motivation you give, it will be in the perspective of the diversity analysis that it comes from. So you see, in all this world of relativity, the bottom line is that if we trace the motivations why we are doing, even in computer science, in particular in computer science, since now we are in this game of globalizing data, I think we can really manage diversity and bias. And since diversity is a local optimum, I think this can do a lot of things. In this slide that I've been talking on, I really try to build in my long history of computer science, since now being pre-odd. And when I was young, I took software engineering 1. They told me, okay, first you do requirements, and then you use the enterprise systems. And by the way, you do the requirements so that they're also robust. Robustness means that you build a system and it should be robust. Robust means this should also work in conditions different from the reason why you designed it. That's what robustness means. Means it should be able to be used also if later on, as it always happens in life, the system is going to be used in different operating conditions. At that time, was the diversity as a bug problem. And then later on, the web came around and the web globalized. And the web globalized, the web was great. The web, everybody was accessible to everything. But then people said, okay, let's integrate the data. No hope. Why? Because everybody had their own view. So then people came around with the semantic web. And by the way, we tried very hard, did a lot of work in the semantic web. We tried to find the final solution to the data integration problem, to the semantic heterogeneity problem. And of course, we failed. We failed with a global solution. Of course, as always in science, we get a lot of good research. But our initial goal was to solve the diversity problem, was failed. Basically, at the moment, and I could argue that there will never be, at the moment there is no general solution which will solve the data integration problem. Why? Because no matter how we integrate, a new problem will come around. You can argue that this guy is biased or not, or that data set is biased or not, but it's going to be different for sure. Bias is a value judgment on top of diversity, but the fundamental notion is diversity. So the bottom line is where I'm now, where I've been working now with Scikit, which is we just take diversity not only as an avoidable, but as a feature. So we want diversity, but we need to learn how to learn about this. We need to learn how to do the local maximum. And these are come to pretty much the closing to the last star, the last slide, which goes as follows. Anytime people tell me there is bias, for sure there is diversity. And for sure there's one of the two parties which are really complaining and thinking that the other party is wrong. And by the way, again, I'm not getting now in the issue whether the other party is right or wrong, because I could even agree with a person saying that there is the real bias. But again, this is me. But the fundamental issue of the bias detection is that really there is a mismatch problem, a mismatch in the representation layer. And this is why I think that the most important solution of the handling diversity, which is fundamental for the solution, is really transparency, tracing, end-to-end process. And I gave you in the previous slides at the beginning the different steps as I see them, or the different steps where transparency starts and where it ends. Then you have to understand, and here the notion of context. I mean, remember I told you one phenomenon is just to formalize it. And this is the general context of the phenomenon, context of the modeling. And the context of the phenomenon depends on what you choose on the word. The context of the modeling depends on the goal you have in mind. And then you exploit it. And really think how good it would be if you could generate a new set of tools like search, diversity-aware search, navigation-aware search, reasoning-aware search. And by the way, some people talk about personalization, some people talk about long tails. These are just applications. But the bottom line is that at the moment, we do not have a general theory of diversity, which I think is at the foundations of the new generation AI in computer science. And it is now, just because of the web, and because now going online, everything more and more online, it just got exposed to more and more diversity. As I said, when there were no computers, we still had diversity, but the diversity was first of all, you see very few people, and we had time to talk to people to learn about that. Right now, in the current situation, the unexpected diversity, as I call it, is just too much, too often, too soon. And this is why I think that the notion of bias and all this kind of general interest and hype on bias and fairness is very good, but as long as it is very good, as long as the new fairness solutions become another standpoint that someone will tell us is the right standpoint, because here what is really the right standpoint from my point of view is only the dynamics of how in time we keep adapting and composing diversity of people to build better tools and also ultimately a better society. Thank you very much.